The diner air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and regret, a perfume Elias Vance had grown accustomed to. He watched Clara stir her latte, the tiny metal spoon making a delicate, rhythmic chime against the ceramic. It was the sound of an ending. He knew it with the same certainty that he knew the sun would rise, that his daughter Lily would need him to make her pancakes in the morning, and that the fortune sitting dormant in his name meant absolutely nothing in this moment. Clara placed the spoon on her napkin with surgical precision. Her movements were always so deliberate, so clean. It was one of the first things he had noticed about her. She never had a hair out of place, a crease in her blouse, or a moment of unstructured time. He knew, her single messy variable. "Elias," she began, her voice as smooth and cool as the polished countertop. "This has been nice." Nice. The word landed like a handful of gravel in his chest. It was a word used for weather, for a stranger holding a door, for a lukewarm cup of tea. It was not a word for 6 months of shared meals, late-night talks, and cautious hopes. It was a word of dismissal. He had been here before. Not in this exact booth, not with this specific woman, but in this same emotional landscape. He was a cartographer of disappointment. He had mapped its every valley and treacherous peak. He thought about the 27 other first dates, or third dates, or 3-month flings since his wife, Anna, had passed. Each had ended with a variation of this conversation, a gentle or not-so-gentle rejection rooted in the same soil. He was a third-grade teacher, a single dad, a good man, they always said, but not an ambitious one, not a man with a future. Would this 28th time be the one to finally shatter the steel walls he'd so carefully built around his heart? "I've met someone," Clara continued, saving him the trouble of a response. She did not look at him, focusing instead on a smudge on her otherwise immaculate fork. "He's a surgeon. Mark Thorne. You might have heard of him. He's chief of cardiothoracic surgery at City General." Elias felt a cold laugh try to climb its way up his throat, but he swallowed it down. Of course he was a surgeon. He was not a plumber or a poet or a postal worker. He was a surgeon, the very archetype of success and stability that Clara craved. The kind of man who could afford the life she felt she deserved. A life Elias could have bought for her 1,000 times over with the interest from a single quarter's earnings. The irony was so thick he could taste it, bitter and metallic like blood. He just nodded. He had to play his part. The part of the humble, slightly heartbroken teacher who understood he was being traded up for a better model. It was the role he had written for himself, and he had become a master at performing it. "I see," he said, his voice even. "That's good for you, Clara. I hope you'll be happy." Finally, she looked at him, and what he saw in her eyes was the final, twisting turn of the knife. It was pity, a deep, genuine pity for the man she saw sitting across from her. A man in a slightly frayed sweater, who worried about grading papers on time, who probably had to budget carefully for his daughter's new shoes. She saw a dead end. "I just need more, Elias," she said, her voice softening into a tone of condescending sympathy. "I need security, a real future. Mark can give me that. You're a wonderful man, you are, and a great father. But your life is small. I need a bigger world." His world wasn't small. It was a collapsed star, a universe of fire and innovation and brutal, soul-crushing pressure condensed into a single, quiet point of light. His life with Lily. He had traded a world of infinite bigness for one of infinite depth. And Clara, in her search for a bigger map, had just sailed right over the deepest part of the ocean without ever knowing it was there. "I understand," he said. It was a lie. He didn't understand at all. He didn't understand how a person could look at a life built on love and purpose and call it small. But he said it anyway. It was what she needed to hear to absolve herself. She reached across the table, her perfectly manicured hand resting on his for a brief, cold second. "Take care of yourself, Elias. And your little girl." Then she was gone. She slid out of the booth, dropped a $10 bill on the table for her latte, and walked out of the diner without a backward glance. She disappeared into the city glare, a ghost of a possibility, leaving Elias alone with the smell of stale coffee and the hollow echo of her judgment. He sat there for a long time, the weight of his secret, his $400 million lie of omission, pressing down on him like a physical thing. He had built a fortress of simplicity to protect his heart, but he had forgotten that sometimes the most painful attacks don't come from those trying to get in, but from those who walk away because they see nothing worth conquering. Elias paid the bill and walked out into the chilly evening air. The city lights seemed to mock him, each one a tiny pinprick of ambition and success. He had run from that world, the world of boardrooms and valuations, the world that had given him everything and cost him nearly as much. He had sought refuge in the quiet dignity of teaching, in the pure, uncomplicated love of his daughter. He had wanted to be seen for who he was, not what he had. He thought about Clara's words. Your life is small. He unlocked the door to his modest, rented house. It was quiet. Lily was at a sleepover, a rare night of silence for him. The silence was usually a comfort, a space to breathe. Tonight, it was an accusation. The worn armchair, the stack of children's books on the coffee table, the half-finished painting Lily had made for him taped to the refrigerator. It all seemed to shrink under the weight of Clara's verdict. He walked into his small home office, a room he rarely used for its intended purpose anymore. In the corner, covered by a dust sheet, was a ghost. He pulled the sheet away, revealing a sleek, powerful computer workstation. Multiple monitors, a server rack humming quietly beneath the desk. It was the command center of his former life, the digital forge where he had hammered out the code that became EduLeap. EduLeap was his symphony, an adaptive learning platform that used artificial intelligence to create personalized lesson plans for every student. It had started as a passion project, a way to help teachers like the ones who had struggled to connect with him when he was a restless, brilliant kid. It had grown into a behemoth, a revolutionary tool that was now in schools across the globe. He had sold the majority stake to a massive tech conglomerate 2 years ago, just after Anna died. The stress of the final buyout negotiations, he was convinced, had contributed to the suddenness of her aneurysm. The money had felt like blood money. So he had taken his fortune, set up a labyrinth of trusts and holding companies managed by a single, loyal lawyer, and he had simply disappeared. He became Elias Vance, third-grade teacher. He moved to a new city where no one knew his face. He traded stock options for story time and shareholder meetings for parent-teacher conferences. He did it for Lily, to give her a normal life, a present father. And he did it for himself, to see if he could find a piece of his own soul again, a piece that wasn't tied to a valuation. He sank into the chair, the ergonomic leather a stark contrast to the hard wooden chairs in his classroom. He powered on the system. The screens flickered to life, displaying market tickers, encrypted emails, and a dashboard showing the real-time performance of his investments. In the 3 hours he had spent being dumped at the diner, his net worth had increased by more than he would make in 10 years of teaching. A wave of cold fury washed over him. He could call his broker. He could buy the hospital where Dr. Mark Thorne worked and have him fired. He could buy the entire block the diner was on and have it demolished. He could buy Clara a diamond so large it would sprain her wrist. The power was there, a coiled serpent at his fingertips. But what would that prove? It would only prove her right. That the world was not small, it was transactional. That his value was, in fact, monetary. It would be a betrayal of everything he had tried to build since Anna's death. A betrayal of Lily. He looked at a framed photo on the desk. It was him and Lily, taken last fall at the school's pumpkin patch. He was kneeling, his arms around her, and they were both laughing, their faces smudged with dirt and pumpkin guts. He was wearing the same frayed sweater he'd had on tonight. In the photo, his life didn't look small. It looked infinite. He powered down the monitors, plunging the room back into darkness. He stood up and pulled the dust sheet back over the console, burying the ghost once more. The anger receded, leaving behind a familiar, hollow ache. He had chosen this life for a reason. He had to believe in that reason, even when the world told him he was a fool. He left the office and closed the door, returning to the quiet, simple house that was either his sanctuary or his prison. At that moment, he truly did not know which. The next morning, the world felt aggressively, painfully normal. The sun streamed through the kitchen window. Lily's empty bowl was on the table where she'd left it before her sleepover, and the school bell would ring in exactly 1 hour. Elias moved through his morning routine on autopilot, the conversation with Clara playing on a loop in his head. I need more. Your life is small. He felt a phantom itch to check his portfolio, a craving for the validation of numbers on a screen. It was an old addiction, one he thought he had kicked. He resisted, focusing instead on packing his worn leather satchel. He put in a stack of graded spelling tests, a worn copy of Charlotte's Web, and an apple, the simple, tangible objects of his chosen life. They felt both comforting and pathetic. When he arrived at Westbrook Elementary, the familiar chaos of the schoolyard was a welcome distraction. Children shouted and ran, their energy a vibrant, uncalculated force. He saw his own students, a knot of them gathered by the swings. They saw him and waved, their faces bright with uncomplicated affection. For them, he was just Mr. Vance, the teacher who told funny stories about his dog and could explain long division in a way that made sense. Their validation wasn't conditional. It was a gift he received every day, and he realized with a pang of guilt how much he had been taking it for granted. As he walked toward the main entrance, a voice called his name. Elias. Morning. He turned to see Sarah Jenkins walking toward him, a cardboard box balanced on her hip. Sarah was the school's art teacher, a whirlwind of paint-splattered jeans, chaotic energy, and relentless optimism. Her classroom was a beautiful mess, a testament to her belief that creativity was more important than tidiness. She had a kind, open face and eyes that always seemed to see a little more than you intended. Morning, Sarah, he said, forcing a smile. Looks like you've got your hands full. Always, she laughed, shifting the box. New clay shipment. My little Picassos are going to have a field day. You look tired. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Sarah had a way of cutting through polite facades. He felt his practiced smile falter. Long night. Ah, she said, her gaze softening with understanding. She didn't press. She just adjusted the box again. Well, if you need an extra shot of caffeine, the machine in the lounge is actually working for once. It's a miracle on par with the changing of the seasons. I'll keep that in mind. Thanks, Sarah. She gave him a final, searching look before heading toward her classroom. Hang in there, Elias. Her simple kindness felt like a balm on a raw wound. Unlike Clara's pity, it wasn't condescending. It was just human, a recognition of a shared struggle. He watched her go, the box of clay seeming like the most important thing in the world. He felt a flicker of something warm in his chest, a tiny pilot light in the cold emptiness Clara had left behind. The school day was a blur of reading circles, math problems, and a minor crisis involving a spilled carton of chocolate milk. Elias threw himself into the work, the rhythm of the classroom a steadying force. He knelt beside a student named Leo, who was struggling with a sentence diagram. It's like building with blocks, Leo, Elias explained, drawing on a piece of scrap paper. The noun and the verb are your foundation. Everything else just adds on to make it stronger and more interesting. Leo's face lit up with understanding. Oh, I get it. In that small moment, the noise in Elias's head went quiet. This was real. This was a tangible good. He wasn't changing the world on a global scale anymore, but he was changing Leo's world, right here, right now. He was building something, just with different tools. For a few hours, he almost forgot about Clara and the surgeon and the smallness of his life. The illusion shattered during his lunch break. He was sitting alone in the teacher's lounge, eating his apple, when he overheard two other teachers talking in the corner. Did you hear about Clara Mayhew? One of them, a fifth-grade teacher named Mrs. Gable, said in a hushed, gossipy tone. Elias froze, his hand halfway to his mouth. The one who was dating Mr. Vance, the other teacher replied. What about her? She's with Dr. Mark Thorne now, Mrs. Gable said, pronouncing the name with reverence. My sister-in-law is a nurse at City General. Says they're the talk of the hospital. He's apparently been spoiling her rotten. Whisked her away to Paris for the weekend. Can you imagine? Wow. Talk about trading up. No offense to Elias, he's a sweet guy, but a teacher's salary versus a chief of surgery, it's not even a contest. The words hit him harder than Clara's had. Hearing the cold calculus of his perceived worth laid bare by his own colleagues felt like a profound betrayal. They saw him the same way Clara did. A stepping stone. A sweet guy who couldn't compete. He quietly stood up, threw the rest of his apple in the trash, and walked out of the lounge. He spent the rest of his lunch period in his empty classroom, staring at the cheerful, colorful posters on the walls. Be kind. Reach for the stars. Dream big. They felt like a joke. That evening, he picked Lily up from her sleepover. She ran into his arms, her face beaming. Daddy, we stayed up super late and told scary stories, and Jamie's mom made waffles with chocolate chips for breakfast. He hugged her tight, burying his face in her hair. Her solid, warm presence was an anchor. Sounds like you had a great time, sweet pea. On the drive home, she was a chatterbox of energy, recounting every detail of the past 24 hours. Then, in the middle of a story about a fort made of pillows, she fell silent. "What is it, honey?" he asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Are you sad?" she asked, her voice small. Kids saw everything. They had no filters, no polite fictions. They just saw the truth. "A little bit, maybe," he admitted. "Is it because of Miss Clara?" He hesitated. "Something like that." Lily was quiet for another moment, kicking her feet against the back of his seat. "I didn't like her very much," she said, matter-of-factly. Elias was taken aback. "You didn't? Why not?" "She always looked at our house like it was dirty," Lily said. "And she asked me once what I wanted to be when I grow up, and I said a painter. And she said, 'Oh, that's a cute hobby, but what will you do for a real job?'" The air went out of Elias's lungs. He had been so caught up in whether Clara liked him that he had failed to see how she viewed his daughter. A cute hobby. The same condescension, the same valuation of worth, applied to a 7-year-old's dream. The last of his romanticized notions about Clara crumbled into dust. "And," Lily added, her voice a little conspiratorial, "she smelled like a magazine." Despite everything, Elias let out a genuine laugh. "She did, didn't she? I like how Miss Jenkins smells better," Lily declared. "She smells like paint and cookies." When they got home, Lily ran to her room to unpack her little backpack. Elias stood in the hallway, the echo of his daughter's words replaying in his mind. She looked at our house like it was dirty. A cute hobby. He had been mourning the loss of a person who never really existed. The Clara he had feelings for was a projection, an idea. The real Clara had been revealing herself all along, and he had been too desperate for connection to see it. A new feeling began to replace the hurt, a slow-burning anger. Not the impotent, destructive fury from the night before, but something different. It was a protective anger. An anger on behalf of his daughter and her dreams. An anger on behalf of every teacher, artist, and dreamer who was ever made to feel that their life was small. He went to Lily's doorway and watched her carefully place her stuffed animals back on her bed. Her world was not small. It was full of magic and color and possibilities that 1,000 surgeons in their sterile, white world could never comprehend. He had made a choice to live in that world with her, and he would not let anyone, not Clara, not his gossiping colleagues, not even the ghost of his own past, make him feel ashamed of it. The following weeks settled into a new, fragile kind of normal. The ache of Clara's departure was still there, but it was a duller, more distant pain, like the memory of a broken bone. Elias focused his energy on his two anchors, Lily and his classroom. He found a renewed sense of purpose in the small, daily victories of teaching. He helped a shy student find her voice during a class presentation. He started an after-school coding club for a handful of interested kids, using old, donated laptops. He was using his skills, his true self, in a small but meaningful way. He also found himself talking more with Sarah Jenkins. They would cross paths in the hallway or the staff lounge, and their brief conversations started to stretch into longer ones. He learned that she was a single mother, too. Her son, Josh, was in the 4th grade. She spoke about art with a fiery passion that he recognized. It was the same passion he had once had for code. She saw the world in color and texture, and he found her perspective fascinating. One afternoon, he was in his classroom after the final bell, cleaning the whiteboard, when Sarah appeared at his door. "Hey," she said, leaning against the frame. "Got a minute?" "For you?" "Always," he said with a small smile. "What's up?" She walked in, her expression a mixture of frustration and worry. "It's the budget meeting. I just came from the district office." "It's not good, Elias." Elias felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The school district had been struggling for years, a slow bleed of funding that left schools like Westbrook constantly scrambling. "They're making cuts," Sarah continued, pacing in front of the desks. "Big ones. They're talking about cutting the music program entirely. And they're slashing my art budget by 70%. 70%. That's not a cut, that's an amputation. I'll barely have enough for crayons and construction paper." Her voice was filled with a passion that bordered on rage. "They don't get it. They see these things as luxuries, as extras. They don't see that for some of these kids, this is the only place they feel successful. It's the only place they get to create something beautiful and be proud of it. For a kid who struggles with reading, a lump of clay can be a lifeline. Elias listened, his own frustration mirroring hers. He knew exactly what she meant. He had started the coding club for that very reason, to give kids another language to be fluent in, another way to build and succeed. What can we do, he asked. The PDA is trying to organize a fundraiser, but bake sales and car washes aren't going to close a six-figure gap, she said, slumping into one of the small student chairs. She looked defeated. There's a final school board meeting next month where they'll vote on it. We can go and speak, but it feels like shouting into the wind. The numbers are the numbers. The numbers are the numbers. The phrase echoed in his head. His life had once been nothing but numbers. Valuations, profit margins, user acquisition costs. He had run from that world, but now, its language was the only one that seemed to matter. He thought about the humming server in his office at home. He thought about the rows of figures on his portfolio screen. A fraction of his wealth could solve this problem in a heartbeat. He could write a check and save the art program, the music program, and a dozen others without even noticing the dip in his account. The temptation was immediate and overwhelming. But how? He couldn't just walk into the district office and drop $1 million check on the desk. That would raise 1,000 questions he wasn't prepared to answer. It would shatter the quiet life he had so carefully constructed. Mr. Vance, the humble teacher, did not have that kind of money. He looked at Sarah. Her face was etched with genuine despair for her students. This wasn't about ambition or status. This was about protecting something vital and good. This was about fighting for the kids. In that moment, a new idea began to form in his mind. A crazy, complicated idea. What if he could use his resources without destroying his life? What if he could be the benefactor without ceasing to be the teacher? There might be another way, he said slowly, the gears in his mind starting to turn, meshing in a way they hadn't for years. Corporate grants. Philanthropic foundations. Sometimes large tech companies have educational outreach funds. They're often underutilized because the application process is a nightmare. Sarah looked at him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. You think? We've tried for some of those before. It's like you said, a nightmare of paperwork. We never get anywhere. Maybe the approach was wrong, Elias said, his mind racing. He knew this world. He knew how to speak its language. He knew how to build a proposal that would get a CEO's attention. He knew which metrics to highlight, which buzzwords to use. Let me take a look at the budget proposal. Let me see the numbers. Maybe I can reframe it. It was a risk. It meant stepping a foot back into the world he had abandoned. It meant using a part of his brain he had intentionally let go dormant. But looking at Sarah's hopeful face and thinking of her students, of his students, being denied the chance to create, he knew it was a risk he had to take. I'd be grateful for any help, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Really, Elias. That night, after he put Lily to bed, he didn't go to the living room to read. He went to his office. He pulled the dust sheet off the console, the gesture feeling different this time. It wasn't an act of angry temptation or lonely nostalgia. It was an act of purpose. He powered on the system. The screens flared to life. He ignored the stock tickers and his personal accounts. Instead, he opened a fresh document and a dozen research windows. He began to dissect the school district's budget, cross-referencing it with the annual reports of major tech corporations. He started to build a proposal, not as a teacher, but as a strategist. He worked for hours, the clatter of the keyboard the only sound in the silent house. He felt a part of himself waking up, an old engine roaring back to life. But it felt different now. It wasn't fueled by ambition or a desire for more. It was fueled by the image of Sarah's worried face, by the thought of Leo finally understanding a sentence diagram, by the memory of Lily declaring she wanted to be a painter. He was forging his two worlds together, using the tools of his past to protect the future of his present. He was no longer just Elias Vance, the teacher or the ghost of a tech mogul. He was becoming something new, something whole. The next month was a whirlwind. Elias and Sarah became a team. During the day, they were teachers. But in the evenings, after their kids were asleep, they would meet in the school library or talk for hours on the phone. Elias worked on the grant proposals, his fingers flying across the keyboard with an old, familiar fluency. Sarah provided the heart. She wrote passionate, moving testimonials about what the arts and music programs meant to individual students. She gathered drawings, photos, and recordings. He provided the cold, hard logic. She provided the undeniable soul. He felt more alive than he had in years. The work was challenging and meaningful. He was using all of himself, the strategist and the teacher, the analyst and the caregiver. And he was doing it alongside someone who saw him, truly saw him, and respected both sides. Sarah never questioned his sudden expertise in corporate finance. She just seemed to accept it, to trust him. "You're really good at this," she said one night, looking over a draft of a proposal he had written. It was aimed at the philanthropic arm of the company that had bought EDU Leap. The irony was not lost on him. "It's so professional. Persuasive. Where did a third-grade teacher learn to write like this?" He froze for a second, the question hanging in the air. This was his chance to tell her, to confess the whole complicated, ridiculous truth. He looked at her open, trusting face, and the words caught in his throat. He was afraid that the money, the sheer scale of it, would change things between them, that it would become the most important fact about him, just as he'd feared with Clara. "I used to be in a different line of work," he said, the partial truth feeling like a lie. "In the tech world. A long time ago." She just nodded, accepting his evasion without another question. "Well, their loss is these kids' gain," she said with a warm smile that both relieved and shamed him. He was building a new connection on a foundation that was still, in its own way, a deception. He submitted 3 major grant proposals under the school district's name. He used his old contacts, sending carefully worded emails from a newly created anonymous address to people in his network, nudging the proposals onto the right desks. He was a ghost in the machine, pulling levers no one knew existed. A week before the final school board meeting, the first acceptance came through. A $50,000 grant from a mid-level software company. Sarah was ecstatic. It wasn't enough to save everything, but it was a start. It was hope. Then, 2 days later, the big one landed. He got an encrypted notification on his private email. The board of the Leap Forward Foundation, the philanthropic entity he had insisted his old company create as part of their acquisition, had approved their proposal. They had awarded Westbrook's district a grant of $1 million, specifically earmarked for arts and technology integration. He stared at the email, his heart pounding. It had worked. It had worked too well. This was more than enough to save the programs. It was enough to transform the district. He called Sarah immediately. When he told her, she was silent for a full 10 seconds before letting out a disbelieving sob of joy. $1 million? Elias, are you serious? $1 million. We did it. You did it. Her joy was so pure, so absolute, that it almost eclipsed his own anxiety. They had won. But his victory felt complicated. He was the anonymous donor, the ghost pulling the strings. He had saved the day, but he had also deepened his secret. The news of the grant sent a shockwave through the district. The budget cuts were immediately taken off the table. The school board scheduled a special session to formally accept the grant and discuss its allocation. Everyone was celebrating. Everyone except Elias. His lawyer, a stern, no-nonsense man named Peterson, called him the next day. "The district superintendent is asking questions, Elias," Peterson said, his voice flat. "A grant of this size, unsolicited, from a major foundation, based on a proposal submitted by a single elementary school. It's unusual. They're looking into the proposal's origin. They're trying to find out who wrote it." A cold dread washed over Elias. "What should I do?" "For now, nothing. Your identity is secure." The submission was anonymous, routed through a dozen proxies. "They won't find you. But be careful. The superintendent, a man named Miller, is a stickler for protocol. He might see this as a Trojan horse." The school board meeting was held in the high school auditorium. It was packed. Teachers, parents, and even students had turned out, the mood festive and triumphant. Elias sat in the back, trying to be invisible. Sarah was near the front with a group of other teachers, her face radiant. She kept looking back at him, giving him small, grateful smiles. Each one felt like a turn of a screw in his chest. The meeting began. The board president spoke in glowing terms about the miraculous grant. He introduced Superintendent Miller to formally recommend its acceptance. Miller was a stern-looking man with a pinched face. He walked to the podium and cleared his throat. While we are, of course, grateful for this unexpected windfall, he began, his tone immediately casting a pall over the room. We must also proceed with caution. This grant was awarded based on a highly sophisticated proposal that did not originate from this office. We don't know who wrote it or why. We have reached out to the Leap Forward Foundation, and while they confirmed the grant's legitimacy, they have been unforthcoming about its genesis. A confused murmur went through the crowd. Furthermore, Miller continued, a grant of this size comes with stipulations. The foundation requires a level of oversight and reporting that our current infrastructure is not equipped to handle. It would require hiring new administrative staff, diverting resources. In short, while the number is large, the hidden costs could be substantial. It is my duty to advise this board that accepting this grant without a full understanding of its origins and obligations would be fiscally irresponsible. The room erupted in protest. People were shouting, standing up. Sarah looked back at Elias, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. He was gutting them. Miller was trying to kill the grant with red tape, likely to protect his own bureaucratic kingdom from outside influence. Elias felt a surge of the cold fury he hadn't felt since the night in the diner. This man was going to steal this victory from these kids, from Sarah, out of fear and pride. He saw a movement near the front of the auditorium. A small group of people had come in late and were taking seats in the reserved section. His blood ran cold. It was Clara, and beside her, looking smug and important in a tailored suit, was Dr. Mark Thorne. Thorne was a major donor to the hospital, which meant he was a player in the city's philanthropic circles. He was probably here to be seen, to network. Clara scanned the room, her gaze sweeping over the crowd of ordinary parents and teachers with a look of faint boredom. Her eyes passed right over Elias, not even registering him. He was just part of the drab background. In that moment, seeing her there, seeing Miller at the podium, a switch flipped in Elias's mind. He was done hiding. He was done letting other people define his worth. He was done letting men like Miller and women like Clara decide what was valuable and what was small. He stood up. He started walking down the center aisle toward the stage. A few people turned to look at him. Sarah saw him, her eyes wide with confusion. Superintendent Miller, Elias said, his voice calm but carrying through the stunned silence of the room. My name is Elias Vance. I'm a third-grade teacher at Westbrook Elementary. Miller peered at him over his glasses. Mr. Vance, this is not the time for public comment. With all due respect, sir, I believe it is, Elias said, continuing his steady walk toward the podium. Because I'm the one who wrote the grant proposal. A collective gasp went through the auditorium. All eyes were on him. He could feel Clara's stare burning into his back. He reached the front and turned to face the crowd. He saw Sarah, her mouth slightly agape. He saw Clara, her face a perfect portrait of shock, her hand clutching Dr. Thorne's arm. I wrote the proposal, he repeated, his voice stronger now. And I can assure you, there is no Trojan horse. The only motive was to ensure that the children of this district don't have their futures compromised by a spreadsheet. Miller sputtered, You? A teacher? That proposal involved complex financial modeling, a deep understanding of corporate philanthropic strategy. That's right, Elias said, turning to face him. It's amazing what you can learn when you have the right motivation. As for the hidden costs you're so concerned about, the administrative oversight, the reporting, you don't need to worry. I'll handle it. You'll handle it. Miller scoffed. And what qualifications do you have? This was it. The point of no return. He took a deep breath. For the past 2 years, my full-time job has been teaching 24 wonderful 7- and 8-year-olds how to read, how to be kind, and how to believe in their own dreams, he said, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the crowd and finally landing on Sarah's. And before that, I was the founder and CEO of the company that created the EDU Leap software platform, the same company whose foundation just gave this district $1 million. So when I say I'll handle the oversight, I mean it. I know the system because I built it. The silence in the room was absolute. It was so quiet he could hear the faint hum of the auditorium lights. He watched the truth detonate. He saw it on Miller's ashen face. He saw it in the dawning wonder in Sarah's eyes. And he saw it, most clearly of all, on the face of Clara Mayhew. Her perfectly composed features had collapsed into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The pity in her eyes had been replaced by a stunning, horrifying comprehension. The small man, the simple teacher she had discarded, was the architect of a world she could only dream of entering. Dr. Thorne looked from Clara to Elias and back again, a frown of confusion on his face. He leaned over and whispered something to her, but she didn't respond. She just stared at Elias, her mind clearly reeling, recalculating every conversation, every shared meal, every moment of her condescending pity through this new, impossible lens. Elias felt no triumph in her shock. He felt nothing at all toward her. She had become irrelevant, a ghost from a life that was no longer his. His focus was on the stage, on the task at hand. "The grant is legitimate," Elias said, his voice ringing with quiet authority. "The money is clean, and the only stipulation is that it be used for its intended purpose, to enrich the lives of our students. Now, I believe the board has a vote to take." He stepped away from the podium and walked over to where Sarah was standing, her friends having melted away to give them space. He stood before her, his heart pounding, suddenly more nervous than he had been when facing the entire room. He had laid his entire secret bare. Now came the real test. "Elias," she breathed, her eyes searching his. There was no greed in her gaze, no calculation. Only a profound, dizzying sense of wonder. Is it all true?" He nodded, unable to speak. She didn't say anything about the money. She didn't ask about the company or the fortune. Her next words shattered the last of his fears. "The coding club," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "The way you explained the budget to me. The way you knew exactly who to talk to. It all makes sense now. You weren't just helping, you were you." She reached out and took his hand. Her hand was warm, calloused from her work, and real. "You are the most extraordinary man I have ever met, Elias Vance." In her eyes, he saw it. The thing he had been searching for all along. Not admiration for his wealth or his past accomplishments, but acceptance of his whole self. The teacher and the tech mogul. The father and the philanthropist. She saw all the pieces and wasn't intimidated or dazzled. She just saw him. Behind them, the board president, his voice trembling slightly, called for a vote. The motion to accept the grant passed unanimously to a roar of applause and cheers. The battle was won. Elias looked over Sarah's shoulder, and his gaze met Clara's one last time across the crowded room. There was a desperate, pleading look in her eyes now. A look that said, "I made a mistake. Can we fix it?" He gave a slight, sad shake of his head. He felt no anger, only a quiet finality. Their chapter was over. Her world was built on valuations, and she had made a catastrophic miscalculation. His was built on value, and he had finally found someone who understood the difference. He turned his back on her for the last time and squeezed Sarah's hand, ready to begin building his new world. 1 year later, the world had bloomed into color. The sterile white of the surgeon's coat and the gray tones of Elias's self-imposed exile had been replaced by a vibrant, chaotic palette, much like one of Sarah's art classes. The Vance Jenkins Foundation, as it was now formally known, had become a quiet force for good in the city's public school system. Elias had not returned to the corporate world. He had brought its best parts, its efficiency, its resources, its ability to scale solutions, to the world he had chosen. He had built a new kind of empire, one measured not in stock price, but in the number of violins in the hands of children, the quality of the laptops in coding clubs, and the vibrancy of the paint on canvases in classrooms across the district. He still worked at Westbrook Elementary, though his role had changed. He was no longer a full-time classroom teacher. Instead, he was a technology and innovation mentor, a title he and Sarah had invented. He floated between classrooms, helping teachers integrate new technology. He still ran the coding club, which now had a waiting list and state-of-the-art equipment. He hadn't abandoned the trenches. He had just brought better tools for everyone to use. His life with Lily was richer than ever. The secret was gone, and with it, the last vestiges of the wall he had built around himself. She knew her dad was special, that he helped a lot of schools, but to her, he was still just daddy. The man who made pancakes on Saturdays, who could fix her bike, and who still read to her every single night. The money had not changed the core of their life. It had only enhanced their ability to share their good fortune. This evening, Elias sat in a familiar booth in a familiar diner. The air still smelled of coffee, but it was no longer tinged with regret. It smelled of promise. Across from him, Sarah was sketching on a napkin, her brow furrowed in concentration as she designed a logo for a new citywide arts festival the foundation was sponsoring. Beside him, Lily was meticulously coloring in a drawing, her tongue sticking out from the corner of her mouth. Josh, Sarah's son, was on the other side of the table, showing Elias the simple game he had designed in the coding club. It was a scene of beautiful, chaotic, domestic peace. Elias looked at Sarah, at the smudge of charcoal on her cheek and the passionate light in her eyes as she worked. His love for her was a quiet, steady thing, a stark contrast to the performative, conditional affection he had mistaken for love with Clara. Sarah hadn't fallen for a tech mogul or a teacher. She had befriended a man and fallen in love with the person he was, in all his complicated glory. He occasionally heard things about Clara. Society pages mentioned her on the arm of Dr. Thorne at a gala or a charity auction. He heard through the grapevine that the relationship was rocky, that she was frustrated by her inability to truly break into the city's old money inner circle. She had gotten the life she thought she wanted, only to find it was as hollow as she was. He felt a distant, abstract sadness for her, the way one might feel for a character in a book who makes all the wrong choices. Sarah looked up from her napkin and caught him watching her. She smiled. "What are you thinking about?" He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "I was just thinking about how big my life is," he said, the words full of a truth that resonated deep in his soul. Her smile widened. She understood. Her world of art, and his world of teaching, and their shared world of family and philanthropy, it wasn't small at all. It was boundless. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, Elias and Sarah sat on the porch of the new house they had bought together. It wasn't a mansion, but a sprawling, comfortable home with a huge yard and a dedicated art studio for her and a high-tech but cozy office for him. It was a house built for a family, for a life to be lived, not just displayed. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly, her head resting on his shoulder. "The other life? The boardrooms and the big deals?" Elias thought for a moment, watching the fireflies blink in the summer twilight. "I miss the challenge sometimes," he admitted. "The feeling of building something from nothing. But I don't miss the reason I was doing it. I was running on empty, trying to prove something to a world I didn't even like." He wrapped his arm around her. "Now, I get to build things every day. A foundation, a new program, a life with you. This is better." He had once hidden his wealth for fear it would define him, that it would prevent anyone from seeing the man underneath. Then he had been rejected for his perceived lack of it, confirming his deepest cynicisms. But in the end, it was neither the having nor the not having that mattered. It was the using. It was the purpose to which he put his resources, both financial and personal. He hadn't needed to choose between being a teacher and a tech genius. He just needed to become himself. All of himself. And he needed someone who was brave enough to love the entire, complicated, wonderful man. He had found her. And in finding her, he had finally, truly, come home.